ingredients that used to be so important to our politics. This is a huge change, and I think trying to foresee its effect is as difficult or more difficult than it was for you and me to foresee how the internet was going to play out 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And so I'm not going to try to give a real answer to your question, because I think most prognostication is foolish and inevitably wrong. But there's no question in my mind that we now have tools that will produce new forms of political expression, new forms of political activity, new audiences for politics. But to what end, to what effect, I wouldn't try to say, because I just don't know.
We'll take a couple more questions. Yes.
James Ryder, I was going to ask, is there a time period in the past in our American history that we can look to, for example, moving forward with regards to special interests and their influence?
Thank you for that extremely good question. It's a discouraging fact, and there's a lot of history in my book because I wanted to learn about this myself and explore it. Why are we in this particular geographic location tonight? We're here because of a deal made in 1793 between three interesting fellows: Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Hamilton initiated the deal because of his eager desire, in effect, to satisfy the bondholders. Hamilton, a young man, brilliant, new Secretary of the Treasury, first Secretary of the Treasury, had the idea that everybody who had loaned money to the Continental Congress or to the 13 colonies to help pay for the War of Independence should be repaid 100%. Now, this was at a time when the paper that had been circulated, that had been the basis of these loans, had been discounted to 20, 30, 15 cents on the dollar. A lot of soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War had been paid in this phony script paper, and they thought they'd gotten $10 for their month of service, but when they sold it to some New York speculator, they only got $3 for the piece of paper. And Hamilton comes forward with the idea that we're going to redeem that paper now for $10. We're going to pay all those debts at face value, because if we don't, we'll never be able to build confidence in this new republic. We'll never get investors. They were then worried about Dutch and English investors to buy bonds and make investments in this new country to get it off the ground. To James Madison particularly, the first great populist and a really wonderful small d Democrat, in my estimation, this was an appalling idea. You are going to reward the money changers of New York and penalize the young men who fought for the creation of this new country by redeeming this paper at face value. It's an outrage. Jefferson tended to side with Madison, but Hamilton had bait. He said, how would you like to have the new national capital down there in Virginia? The capital, the idea of a federal district was in the Constitution that was in force, but nobody had yet decided where it would be. In fact, everybody in the 13 colonies had an idea, right here, it should be right here. But this deal was struck, and that's why the Capitol was built on the, not too many miles from George Washington's house on the banks of the Potomac River. A long-winded way of saying making deals for money has been part of the American experience from the beginning. And we don't like that. One of my favorite lines in this book is my assertion that Americans are very romantic and never like to confront the truth about themselves. And the truth is, I believe, that the great American pastime is making money and always has been. And money in politics has been here all the time. But one of the things I discovered doing this research was that I had grown up in an era which was anomalous, untypical. I really believe now that from the 1933, the beginning of the New Deal, through the first Nixon administration, it was an unusual era of public service and public spiritedness, in which a very interesting taboo culture grew up. You just don't do things, for money. You don't behave that way. There's a wonderful example you may remember when, Carr, you have to help me. The Irish congressman who lost to Don Regal in the Senate primary from Michigan. Irish last name. Your colleague, a good guy, lost to Regal. It's in the book. Jim O'Hara. Thank you.
Jim O'Hara?
Jim O'Hara, very popular, beloved liberal Democratic congressman from Michigan with Mr. Carr. Runs against Regal 82, 80, 78 maybe. Anyway, in that era. And loses. And comes back to town. He's got 6 or 7 kids and no job. And he doesn't know what to do. He goes to work for Tommy Boggs, one of the biggest lobbyists in town. And it causes a bit of a scandal. Jim O'Hara, that good liberal, is going to be a lobbyist? Gee, you don't do things like that. That's wrong. There's a wonderful quote from Leon Panetta in my book about this. He said, yeah, he would come up to the Hill, and I didn't want to talk to him. A lot of us didn't want to talk to him. We didn't approve of that kind of behavior. It was just something that wasn't done. A congressman becomes a lobbyist? Well, as I said in my talk, we now have about 200 former congressmen. And I don't mean to suggest that these are all bad people or doing bad things. They're not. It's just that this kind of revolving door career change used to be looked down upon. But not in the early 20th century, certainly not in the Gilded Age, not at many other times in American history. It was just in this little period, I think, from the early 30s to the early 70s, when this kind of Puritan ethic grew up in Washington, which has again been blown away. So I fear that the answer to your question is probably not. And it isn't in our nature, which is why, personally, my own prescriptions for how to fix all this mostly do involve transparency and making sure everybody knows what everybody else is doing. For example, why not make every government official and member of Congress and staffer on Capitol Hill report on the internet, a wonderful tool for this, at the end of every day? Here's the lobbyists I spoke to today. Here's what I spoke about. I think that would have a big impact on the system. Oh, and better yet, and tomorrow I have these following appointments with lobbyists. Let the world really know what's going on. I think that would have a very cleansing effect. But of course, it would have to be passed by Congress.
We have time for one more question.
Final question here, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So I'll treat this as a 12-step program and say that my name is Alicia, and I'm a registered lobbyist. And so I want
New York University.
From
yes.
New York University, from a nonprofit. But I would like your perspective on 2 different things. And one really is the nuance of this conversation. I actually advocating for a nonprofit where we are doing most of our work on behalf of student aid and the NIH and NSF pods. We do feel a little ostracized in this community now where you can't step into this administration if you've ever had the word lobbyist affiliated with your name. So I would like your perspective on this of how do you try to treat this conversation with more of a nuance? And, I'll honestly say my check writing every year maybe hits about $1,000 or $2,000 a year, but it's certainly not anything significant. So I would like your perspective on the nuance of this conversation, because I do think a lot of people are getting swiped up in this whole ostracization of lobbyists. The second question is I would like your perspective on New York has passed laws just recently to where I'm limited to what I can give. I can give, for instance, only a very small portion, $200, $300 a year, whereas private citizens can give $4,000. Personally, I'm very happy for that. That's all coming out of my pocket, but it really does start to try to get at the money and the influence in the system, and whether you think that type of change really makes a difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me answer the second first because it's easy. I have a few pages of ideas. Interestingly, a lot of the best ideas have been around for years about what to do about this. If the definition of a lobbyist, as I suggested in the Daschle story, is inadequate, but if we had a better definition of lobbyist, and then we just had a rule which said something very similar. If you're a registered federal lobbyist, you and your wife can only give $200 a year to political campaigns. Most of the lobbyists in Washington would be thrilled, like you. And it's perfectly legal, even under the bad Supreme Court decisions. It would appear to be a legal thing to do. And I think it perfectly sensible. And the biggest problem, in my view now, about lobbyists and fundraising is bundling. It's where the lobbyist goes out and finds 20 people to give $1,000 each, and then is able to come to the candidate and say, I've bundled $20,000 for you. It sounds like real money, and it has an effect. Thank you very much for introducing the first question, because I failed tonight to give the little speech that I'm about to give, and I'm glad to have an opportunity to do it. The First Amendment of the Constitution, so important to me as a journalist, also says that Congress shall pass no law to interfere with the public citizens' rights to petition the government for redress of grievances, and that's lobbying. Lobbying is a healthy, constitutionally protected expression of the democratic impulse. We should not be against lobbying, in my view. On the contrary, we should encourage lobbying, and for everybody, not just for fat cats, but in fact, indeed, particularly not necessarily for fat cats, but for everybody. And any good member of Congress wants to hear from everybody with an opinion on the issue of the day. It is legal. It should be legal. And I think the stigmatization of lobbyists, as I said in my remarks, is unfortunate because it's gone too far. I was taken aback yesterday at lunch with a senior official of the Obama administration, in the White House official, where it is understood that they've created a problem for themselves with this ban. This guy who should be in a position to be able to answer his own question better than I said, do you have a thought about how one could define good lobbyists versus bad lobbyists? By which he meant, is there a way that we could exempt people like you from our ban on lobbyists, but not exempt the lobbyist for Citibank, Nick Callio, who they really don't want to have in their administration? I don't consider that my job as a journalist and a writer, but I'm intrigued that they are thinking about it. It isn't easy because one woman's idea of a noble cause, not for profit, but for the truth and justice, is the next person's idea of a special pleading by a special interest, because these are subjective categories. There's a pretty hard job to make them objective, I think. But it is an interesting problem, and I think we could come up with ideas for how to make it more subtle and more effective. But we live in grays, and all attempts to reduce grays to blacks and whites, while appealing for cable television news, are never going to do justice to reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Bob, for a splendid talk and discussion. We shall arise and go now, those of you who would like to, in the next room for a little reception over there. I reiterate how grateful I am, both personally and to all of you for having come tonight, and particularly how grateful I am to our speaker, Bob Kaiser, who's done a brilliant job for us. Thank you. Good job. Hey, Joe.